Welcome to Disaster Risk Management for Sustainable Development course. It's a hybrid one. I'm Nurul Alum, Resilient Infrastructure Specialist for Asian Disaster Preparedness Center, and I'm looking after the risk assessment part here. Today I will talk about Module 2 Disaster Risk Identification and Assessment. No risk, no risk. Start with 2023 Turkey-Syria earthquake. More than 4,000 people died, where around 20,000 people injured with this magnitude 7.8. Around 6,200 buildings, including critical infrastructure, collapsed in 10 provinces across Turkey. So look at this, like the country like Turkey had this kind of devastating effect during a earthquake. What will happen to some developing and underdeveloped countries where the urbanization is rocket high, but the urbanization or development is not going on plan. That requires the rationale for risk assessment, and today we'll talk about it. At the end of the module, participants will have basic understanding of disaster risk assessment, its process, its outcomes, and also who can do it. Participants will have basic ideas on how disaster risk assessment results are being used. We'll have 3 sessions, starting with this session, session 1, products of disaster risk assessment, session 2, disaster risk assessment process, and finally, application of risk assessment outputs. So starting with session 1, products of disaster risk assessment. In any risk assessment project, we come up with several maps and reports. Mostly the maps are coming up like a hazard, exposure, and risk maps with the damage reports, potential damage reports for different areas. So we are showing you some of the ADPC's product across Asia Pacific region, which has been now being used by government agencies for taking any risk-informed decision in those countries. Now let's start with what is disaster risk. So risk can be identified as the combination of the probability of an event and its negative consequences. It's a function of hazard, vulnerability, and exposure, where hazard is a natural physical phenomenon which can lead to a loss of life or damage to objects, buildings, and environment. Exposure can be people, property system, and any other built environment elements present in hazard zones that are thereby subject to potential losses. And the vulnerability, the level of possible loss or injury or damage to human, object, buildings, and the environment, which can result from the natural hazard. So disaster risk is defined as the combination of probability of an event and its negative consequences. So if you look at this storm left side happening in a desert, and there is nothing to damage, so there is no risk. But the same storm, if it comes to a built environment where there are a lot of buildings with different vulnerabilities, different construction patterns, different physical setting, we can see a lot of vulnerabilities and risk of damage to the buildings. Now, what is risk? So if we look at this figure, we have a few houses and a river here with the river plain, which is demarcated as yellow color. So 2 houses in the right side are placed in river floodplain, where we have another house in the left side of the river, which is actually away from the floodplain. So now the hazard here is plausible flooding, and if we see like 2 buildings are exposed to this possible flooding, one is not. But one of the house in the floodplain has been raised a little bit. So if we look at it, then the left side of the river is having either no or low risk, where in the right side there are 2 buildings which were exposed to hazard, but due to some intervention, one building became less vulnerable. So this shows us like how risk can be imagined and how risk information can be used to take any intervention and that can reduce our future vulnerabilities. What does a risk assessment do and why it is important? So risk assessment, a methodology to determine the nature and extent of risk by analyzing potential hazards and evaluating existing conditions of vulnerability that together could potentially harm exposed elements, such as people, property, services, livelihood, and the environment on which they depend. So it's an initial step in the DRM process. The probability and extent of risk in a particular location and time frame are very important information, and this actually provides DRM process to initiate any DRM activity. Based on the recognition that risk is the result of the link interplay between hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, anybody can take a decision which is risk involved. The purpose of the risk assessment within the DRM process to identify possible hazard and vulnerability of population groups, to analyze these and to estimate and assess both the probability of occurrence and the possible potential damage, to identify and study possible weaknesses and gaps in existing protective and adaptive strategies, to formulate realistic recommendations for measures to overcome weaknesses and reduce the identified and assessed disaster risk, and to agree these with those affected. So upon here, we are ending with session 1 and we will be looking at you again in session 2.